Brands on Brands.
Hey, what's up, everyone? Today's show is an interview with Julie Broad from booklaunchers.com. We're talking all about self-publishing. Check it out.
In a world where content is king and your reputation is your brand, how do you build a brand that matters? Welcome to Brands on Brands, a home for those that think different and push their boundaries. This is where branding that matters lives. Now, here is your host, Brandon Birkmeyer.
Hey, what's up? Welcome to Brands on Brands. I'm Brandon Birkmeyer, your personal branding coach, and today is an interview episode. We are talking about self-publishing. That's right. If you want to figure out how to write a book, promote a book, publish a book, all of that yourself as a self-published author, we are talking about today with the one and only Julie Broad. She is the founder of a self-publishing services firm called Book Launchers. That's right, booklaunchers.com. And she herself is an Amazon overall #1 best-selling author and knows what it takes to successfully self-publish a book. Her popular YouTube channel, Book Launchers TV, is out there helping people, especially nonfiction authors specifically, write and market books that people want to read. And I like that she puts out there this hashtag no boring books, right? With the theme of, really making these books worth reading. Her titles herself include a book called More Than Cash Flow, which topped Amazon, another book called The New Brand You, and her latest book from 2021 called Self-Publish and Succeed, which has now won 13 different indie publishing awards. She is an expert on writing a book with marketing in mind and teaches those approaches on how to get results, make an impact, and ultimately make more money. She always leaves people inspired, excited, and with clear action steps to take. You'll hear that on today's chat. You can also have found her. She's been featured in many places. She speaks all around the country. She's been featured in Forbes, Entrepreneur.com, Yahoo Business, CTV, the Toronto Sun, and many more local and national TV shows. She is a Canadian, but lives in the United States. And all that and more is at booklaunchers.com. But today, we really dive into all the questions I had about what do you do to get a book off the ground? How do you self-publish? What's important? How do you come up with titles? All of those things. And then some funny questions about audiobooks and how do you convert a podcast into a book, or how do you convert a book into a course? Things like that. All that we talk about today. So if that sparks your curiosity, I'd encourage you to keep on listening as we jump into the show. Let's go.
Brands on Brands.
All right, let's get going. I'm excited to welcome our guest today, Julie Broad, to the show. Julie, first and foremost, thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. The reason I'm excited is we get to talk about something that I think is really important, especially for people in the personal branding space, which is how to write, publish, and promote a book. Especially you guys focus on nonfiction books. So we'll talk a lot about that today. But I think this is especially important for someone when your reputation can drive your business working or not working. I think this is huge, but let's start there. Let's set this up a little bit for everyone. To you, as someone who's doing this and helping people with this all the time, what's the value of writing a book? Why does it matter?
Yeah, I think for somebody that's working on their personal brand or growing a brand, it's interesting because when you go to submit a speaking submission, it doesn't say, have you written a book? It says, what books have you written? And, it's like this benchmark, right? If you're going to go on media, so television, news media, they usually want a list of the books and other kind of proof of credentials that you have. A degree is no longer kind of this, the accepted that you're an expert, right? You're not an expert because you've got a degree. You're an expert because you've written a book on the subject. So it's kind of that level that you need for a lot of the bigger things that a lot of people want to do as far as media and speaking and other pieces. And it's also that final credibility that I think you don't get with very many other things. Podcasting is great, blogging is great, but it's still not the same as being the author of the book on.
Yeah, I think that's probably the choice that a lot of people end up making first is figuring out, well, let me kind of just start these things that are a little easier to do. And then maybe they'll build a following even. And I think a lot of people, once they have some of that influence, they maybe stop and say, maybe I don't need the book. With so many things out there to focus on, I'd say, why is this relevant even today? I mean, because I've seen people with influential relationships and no book still get business. So is it just that you want to get booked on TV shows, or is there something else to it?
Yeah, it depends on your bigger picture goals. I mean, I don't think there's ever a rule of this is how you have to do it and you have to have a book or, those kind of things. But it is something that makes a really big difference for people who are consulting. We've had many clients who've added a zero to their fees, which is pretty significant to add a zero to your fees, a year after your book has come out. If you're a speaker and you don't have a book, you're leaving money on the table because your paid contract is there's kind of two contracts. There's the contract that gets you paid for speaking, and then there's a contract plus books. And 50%, if not more, are going to take the contract plus books. And so you've just missed out on all of that money 50% of the time for those book sales. If you're selling online courses, a book is a tremendous way to feed people into that course. If it doesn't, you don't have to have it, you can pay for ads, you can do all those kind of things, but a book has such a beautiful long life. It's one of those things where I have a book that I published in 2013 for my real estate training and education company that I owned before book launchers. And it still generates leads for the person who bought the website from me because the book, that's 10 years later, and it's still generating leads. People don't throw books out. They pass them to their friends. They donate them to the libraries, and more people read them. And that's something you can't get with an ad that you pay for on Facebook. That book has a long life, and somebody probably paid you for that book in the first place. So you had monetized marketing that has a massively long shelf life. So, those are just a few of the powerful reasons. Yes, you can have a life and a business without a book, but it has powerful, kind of gas on a fire type potential if you do it right.
Yeah, I think what I've seen is like books can become business cards in a lot of cases. Like I've seen people like that's the way to go. But to your point about it also being a revenue driver, I think that's huge and not something a lot of people think about at all. They're thinking about how do I get sponsorships or advertisers. But especially if you're speaking, I could see how that could be a huge asset. Absolutely. Let me ask you this, because I know the people who maybe they've already been thinking about creating a book, but maybe the people who haven't, would you say that everyone should write a book, or are there cases where they shouldn't?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of people who say everybody has a book in them, but that doesn't mean everybody should write a book, because I think there are some people who just won't give it the energy that it requires to do well. And I do think it's one of those projects where I don't want to stress people out, but once you've published a book, it's impossible to unsell the copies of books that have been sold. So if you're not happy with what you've put into the world and you want to kind of hit undo, it's not that easy to hit undo. It's not like a blog post that you're not happy with that you delete and now nobody, maybe they use the Wayback Machine, but otherwise they can't get it. And so it's one of those things where I think you want to make sure that if you're doing a book, you're going to put the energy, the, investment, because you want to hire professionals to make it edited, to design it and all those pieces. So I think you have to be ready. But I don't necessarily think everybody has to write a book. And I, don't know if everybody has a book in them either.
Yeah, no, I could see that. And I think maybe it's just sometimes it's not even the right time for someone along the way. I do want to dive into this idea of self-publishing, which is kind of your kind of real focus and expertise. And because I want to ask, what do you think gets people in the way of getting them started? But I already think it's that. I think it's that it's just so daunting. But let's talk about self-publishing. Like, what is that? I guess let's explain that to people. And then what are the benefits?
Yeah. So, I mean, typically there's kind of three ways of publishing, right? There's traditional, which is a publisher gives you a book deal. Sometimes you get an advance, which is just an advance against the money that will be made as you sell books. People have typically in the past anyways, seen that as the ideal. However, what they don't realize is that, especially in nonfiction, the publisher now owns what you have written. And so if, say, for example, a television production company wants to come along and license or even buy your rights to create a television show or a movie or documentary, they're not negotiating with you. They're negotiating with the publisher. because this doesn't belong to you. So even if you've put your stories, your life stories into that book, it's not yours to negotiate with anymore. I've had people who have sold courses that have traditionally published that couldn't keep selling the courses under the same name as the book because the publisher owned all of that. So there's a lot of nuances to that. And you actually don't make that much money. Like 80 cents per book sold is a pretty decent contract. So you could do the math on how little you're making. But again, it's always kind of been the traditional path for people. So that's typical. There's a middle ground where there's kind of these companies that act like publishers, but they charge you a fee. And the main advantage of going with them is that they have some bookstore distribution. So if you want some physical bookstore distribution and you don't want to go through a lot of extra hoops, which you have to do when you self-publish, kind of this hybrid, they call it, model might be a good choice for you. You pay them a fee. They kind of are a publisher, but they're not, it doesn't function as they don't own the rights usually. They do still usually charge a per book copy or royalty. There's different contracts. So that's the middle ground. Self-publishing is you're in charge. Self-publishing is you keep all rights, you keep all royalties, but you also have to kind of oversee everything. And then that's where companies like Book Launchers comes in, where we kind of act like a publisher so that you don't have to figure out, how do I hire a developmental editor? How do I hire a copy editor? Where's a good cover designer? How do I do this metadata research? Like our company oversees all of that. But at the end of it, you're the CEO, so you make all the final decisions, you keep all rights, you keep all royalties, everything's in your name. But if you don't do that, you're hiring all those pieces, you're being the general contractor and kind of doing it. But the advantage is it's your book and you can do whatever you want with it. You can license off parts of it. You can sell the rights. You can, do courses, you can do television shows, and you can keep all of the money in that process too.
Yeah, I think I'm a huge advocate for anyone trying to protect their intellectual property and be able to monetize it, because you never know that first book you write, it might be the one that you just happen to capture the lightning in a bottle that then could really turn into something that you make money off of. And if you give all that away, I've heard people giving that away. Even I hear that with Netflix now. People like they got a Netflix thing, but they just wanted to have that credential and didn't make the money because they were just happy to be, acknowledged. It sounds like a scary thing to have to learn all this, take this on. And even with the help of somebody, it feels like there's so much that you don't know what you don't know, right? Let's talk about the beginning phases of this. So when you meet someone who's like, yeah, I kind of like, I've had this idea, or, I want to finally get this thing done that I've been thinking about. How do you help them kind of take those first steps towards, kind of moving past the fear and getting started?
Yeah, one of the big mistakes I think is people go, oh, I want to write a book. And then they sit down and they write it. And, there's a whole bunch of things you want to think about before you do that. Because some people get scared later. Some people have the fear of starting, but some people start and then they get scared, or they go all the way, but they haven't figured out a lot of the pieces that would have set them up for success. So one of the first things we look at is, what's that bigger picture goal? Like, what are you hoping this book achieves? Because book sales are great. But, even if you're selling 10,000 copies of your book, that's a short-lived paycheck. Like, what's the bigger picture of all of this, that you're doing it for? And then make sure that you understand how the book is going to help with that. And then you want to figure out who your reader is. And you want to do all of this before you start writing, so that you have a book that's positioned to achieve your goal, but also so that you have clarity around who your person is. And a lot of people will come to me and say, oh, it's women between the ages of, 30 and 55. And I'm like, no, it's not a demographic, and it's not really, your person when you're like, this person is laying awake at night thinking about this, this aspiration or this fear, and my book's going to help them with that. Because, if you can answer that question really clearly, then I think you probably know your reader well enough to start writing your book. A lot of people, though, have been told they should write a book, and they say, people are like, oh, your story is amazing, you should write a book. And they forget that might be about them, but it's not for them. It's for their reader. So those are two pieces that we spend a lot of time on before you ever get to the phase where you're writing a book.
Yeah. I think goals are, for anything, I work with a lot of content creators, and it's the same thing. I think figuring out why you're doing something is obviously critical. I'm curious to hear your answer, and I can share with you mine. What do you hear as the goal that's usually it ends up not being the goal? What's like usually the first goal that's the most obvious, but then it ends up changing half the time?
Well, a lot of people want to be a bestseller, right? They're like, I want to be a bestseller. And it might be Amazon bestseller, New York Times bestseller, which, by the way, self-published, and anybody with a small publisher, it's a curated list. So even if you outsell the number one, you're still not going to be on the New York Times bestselling list. But they want to be a bestseller, and that's great. My first book went to number one overall on Amazon. So it outsold Game of Thrones and Dan Brown. That was fun. I'm not going to take away from that, but Ellen didn't call and Oprah didn't call. Like nobody really cared that this self-published book on real estate investing got to number one, really. And so what's more important is that bigger picture objective. And for some people that's impact, and they feel like bestseller means impact. But I always like to kind of understand, like, how are you defining impact and how are you defining success? Because if you really all you care about is bestseller, you can buy it, right? Like there's companies out there that will curate and kind of orchestrate your bestseller status, and people pay for it. So, but for me, it's like, why does the bestseller matter? Well, if it's because you think it means more impact, well, what else can we do that's actually going to drive more impact? Like if you speak at schools, maybe that's actually going to be the impact. And we can use the book as a tool to get you into the schools so you can have that impact. So, that's usually, I don't know what your answer was, but that's usually what it is.
Yeah. No, well, stick for that for a second before I get to mine. Cause accolades, I think absolutely are what come to mind. Like I want some kind of social proof, right? And the idea of being a bestseller and being able to say that is what I think some people think is a social proof. But it's funny is the social proof is just that it exists, and it is that it's in alignment with what your knowledge is, what your perspective is, and the thing that you want to teach people is. I think just that it's being created and that it's in alignment makes sense. So creating a book that's out of alignment with what you want to talk about, what you want to teach, what your ideas are, I think would be completely off goal, even if it did make, a top selling list or whatever it is. So yeah, that I think rings true. But let's just answer this if they're wondering, like, but how do I get on Oprah? Like, if that's my goal, tell us, Julie, how do I get on Oprah?
When you figure it out, let me know. I can't say we've ever gotten a client on Oprah.
Man.
We've got 2020, we've got Good Morning America. We've got, I think Dr. Phil actually wanted to pay one of our clients and our client actually turned them down. So, but yeah, Oprah, we have not figured that one out. We haven't cracked that nut.
All right, guys, we're working on it, guys. We'll figure it out. We'll put it on a YouTube channel, let you guys know, and sell it for $1 million. But okay. So yeah, in my line of work, I think what we hear a lot is that the goal tends to be audience, right? It tends like, I want to have 1 million subscribers, or I want to have 1 million followers, or whatever that thing is. And I think that there are so many advantages to creating content in general, which I talked about a little bit. And I think that is what's often overlooked. What have you seen? Because I think what probably happens is once they've created one book, now they're thinking about number 2 and number 3. I'd love to hear like what you think are some of the rewards you've seen, or some of the changes that you've seen in the people who are out there and they're creating these books. What are some of the things you've heard from them that's like, oh my God, this isn't even what I thought it was going to be?
Yeah. I mean, first of all, I do some interviews with clients, and the number one thing, when I would say, like, what surprised you the most after your book came out? The number one thing is always like the emails of people they don't know that have read their book and their lives have been positively impacted. Like that's hands down, almost universal, the number one thing that surprises people. But it's been interesting. Like we have one client who, her channel, she has a YouTube channel called Kathy Loves Physics. And while she was writing her book, her channel grew by 100,000 subscribers. And her channel's been around for a while. And it's not to say that the book led to the channel growth, but the content that she was putting on the channel was very similar to the content that she was putting into the book. And so it's like that thought process of getting clarity around what you need to say and who you're telling these stories to. In her case, it's all historical. Her book's called Lightning Tamers, about kind of the history behind electricity and all the drama and that kind of thing. And so telling those stories on her channel just went crazy. And so that's really cool to see. And I think a lot of people underestimate the value of, because it is hard work. Like I'm not going to say, hey, it's so easy, write a book today. There's people out there that will say you can write a book fast, but it's probably not going to be good. But the value of the thought process that goes into thinking this through people constantly find that it refines their message, and that helps their marketing. That helps them talking to their customers, which leads to more sales. And in her case, it was more content for her channel that was really hitting the mark, which also was very encouraging and helped her book launch quite nicely too.
Yeah. So what does get in the way? I mean, I bet there's a point where people say, you know what, I'm just going to do it. I'm curious what you've seen that catalyst be where people finally take the plunge. Like what's getting in their way, and what have you seen helps them overcome that?
Yeah, I mean, I think everybody has kind of four monsters that hold them back, that I call them the monsters. You have your fear of judgment, you have your imposter syndrome, which I think is a really big one. Like a lot of people are looking around going, who am I to write a book? And that I often say, well, if you're looking at your peers thinking you shouldn't write a book, those aren't the people you're probably going to write the book for, right? When I published my real estate book, which is the example I always give, I think I had done, I don't remember. I think it was like it was 30 deals, I think, at the time. And I didn't own 30 properties. I think I owned 15 at the time, but I'd done 30 deals. And I was looking around at all these people who'd written books and done hundreds of deals. And I was feeling like this book is not going to matter. Like nobody's going to want to read this book. But I eventually kind of realized that the person who needed my book was trying to get deal one done, or they'd done one and it was a disaster. And so if you look at the person that you're writing the book for, they're probably going to relate a lot more to you being closer to where they're at in their journey, but far enough ahead that you can, look back and say, hey, like there's a big pit right there, like jump over top of that and hey, drive around this spot, and guide them to where they want to go. That I think really helps people get over imposter syndrome. But that's a big, big, big one. I think that stops people from ever starting is like that, who am I to write this book? But if you think about the person who, or even if it's kind of similar to your story, like what would you have wanted? Like, would this book have helped you? That often can help with that. And then, fear of success and fear of failure are also big ones for people. They don't always hit at the beginning. They're not always the thing that stops them, but it could be the thing that makes them ask for 45 cover revisions or just never let the book leave layout. And I think, again, everything goes back to that person you're writing to have the impact and kind of the bigger picture goals. So the impact for you on your life, your business, your company, if you have a team, on them, but then also just think about that single person that if you don't ever publish this book, who's going to help them? Like who is going to help them? And a lot of times that can help you get over that hump and get to where you want to go. So if you can't get excited enough about what it's going to do for you, get excited about what it's going to do for somebody else.
Yeah, exactly. Is that all four monsters?
Yeah. The fear of failure, fear of success, imposter syndrome, and fear of judgment. And the fear of judgment too is one of those things where I think it's kind of like when you step on a stage. If you're looking at everybody and trying to make everybody in the room like you, you're going to be terrified. But if you just find that one person in the audience that you're like, I'm going to help you today, it helps kind of keep the fear of judgment at bay. And it goes back to that reader.
Yeah, I have so many questions about this, but I'm going to start with some easy ones because people are like, well, how long does this really take? Is it 2 years? Is it 1 year? Is it all dependent on how fast and how slow I am? Like, let's talk about the timing of this and the effort.
Yeah, I mean, really, it truly does vary. We have clients who work with writers, and typically the process is a little more predictable when you work with a professional writer. So most of those folks are launching their book within 12 months. And occasionally it's a bit faster. And if they, ask for 42 cover revisions, well, then we're looking at, 15 months. But if you're writing it yourself, it can take you a year to write it. We've had clients write it in 12 weeks. We have a course actually where we help people write it in 12 weeks. But then, the thing is when you write a book really fast, what you find is your editing is going to take longer because, you got the content out, but now that content needs a lot of refinement and polishing to make it really great for the reader to go through. And so for them, you're probably looking at a year and a half total from, start to launch the book. But yeah, it's a 9-month project at the minimum in order to get it written, get a really good couple rounds of editing in and design. And that's dedicating about 2 to 5 hours most weeks. If you have a lot more time, you can go a little faster, but you're still going to have a certain timeline because you need professionals that are going to dig into your book and go through it at various points.
Yeah. And if you guys want to know more about this, just because I know people are like, I'm curious. Definitely go to booklaunchers.com and check out everything there. Julie has written a book on How to Self-Publish. It's called Self-Publish and Succeed, the No Boring Books Way to Writing a Nonfiction Book That Sells. That came out in 2021. Julie, I'm going to tell you, I like how you've set up the book. I haven't gone through the whole thing yet, but when I interview people who've written books, I love going to Amazon, looking through dive into the book, and it shows me the initial pages. And I love looking at the chapters and the subchapters, just the names, because half the time I can actually pretty much know 80% of the book just by looking at how they titled things and using my imagination. Because it's like, oh, how to, be a photographer. And it's like, here are the chapter names. Step 1, buy the right camera. Step 2, it's like, find the right environment, learn lighting. I'm like, okay, so I have a sense for it. For your book, I was really kind of intrigued because the chapters themselves are titled like I would title YouTube videos to really grab people's attention. So I think you really stuck to the no boring books mantra because all of them were enticing. And I want to know more about, and I'll give you some examples, guys. Some of the chapters such as ghost hunting your way to a book, or the unexpected problem with book editors, or the reader only cares about one person and it's not you. Like things like that really pulled me in. But here's one that I want to know, just because we are friends. I hope you will indulge me, Julie. Chapter 11, 20 pages can make or break your sale. What does that mean? I need to know what this chapter is about. I promise I'm going to buy this book after the call. What is this all about?
Yeah, well, you've actually kind of just alluded to why the first 20 pages are so important. So Amazon has the look inside feature. And a lot of people will do exactly what you did, which is browse those first 20 pages. A lot of people waste those first 20 pages. They'll write a really self-focused introduction that's like meandering about what, how they were walking in the forest one day and inspiration struck. Nobody cares. They want to know why they should read this book. And if you're going to solve the problem that they have, that this has got them clicking on it. And so you want everything that's in those first pages to sell your book, and your chapter titles, which is beautiful. Like you've exactly kind of identified something that I think is really important, which is those chapter titles are often the final decision maker, because people go, have I read all the stuff in this book before? And they use the chapter titles to determine whether it's going to be worth their time. It's not about the money, right? Books are less than $20. People aren't usually deciding whether they're going to put $20 in. They're deciding whether they want to put their time in, whether they want another book on their Kindle or on their bookshelf. And if you don't use every chapter title to sell your book, you're missing out. And I approach everything in the first 20 pages of your book as, is this going to sell my book? Even your dedication. Does it kind of make, does somebody want to spend 8 hours with the person who wrote this dedication? Think about the Oscar speeches, right? You get to kind of get a sense of somebody's personality from these things. So that is the essence of what those first 20 pages is.
I feel like I got so set up, and that was not on purpose. It's very,
beautiful.
very meta. That happened. I was not planning on that. I thought it would be some mystical, like 20 pages you throw towards the middle or end. That's like, and don't forget to go to my website. And it was like, oh, you were reading my first 20 pages and you got intrigued about it. Very meta of you. And I'm glad that we went through that, because I think that's super interesting. I think you can apply that to book writing, but it's a lot of things that, like, what's the first 10, 20%, 5%, whatever it is, the thing that people see first that's going to make them want more, that's going to give them enough to say, this is exactly what I'm looking for, but also it's not something I've heard before, and I might need this in my life. I think that I haven't seen that applied like this, and I think that that's brilliant. I appreciate you diving into that with me a little bit.
I'm glad you asked the question. It was perfect.
Yeah, we get lucky sometimes over here. So let's kind of ask what I would call a kind of basic Brandon question, which is going to be just, what makes a book good? So we don't waste our time with this stuff. Like, what makes a book good? I don't want to waste readers' time. I don't want to waste my time. I know you call it #NoBoringBooks. So let's get into that a little bit.
Yeah. So there's a few parts to it. And the first we've already touched on, which is that you've written it for a reader with a very specific kind of intention. So even if it's a memoir, there's still an intention for the reader. Like when they're done reading this memoir, if they now are going to feel hope or inspired, let's get a little more specific. Like, what does that hope and that inspiration do in their life? Like, what's different now that they've experienced it? Because when you focus on the reader as you write, you'll make it a lot more interesting. And that's really, really important. And that's kind of fundamental. And if you don't have something that is even a little bit different, we call it a hook, than all the other books, because there's inevitably probably thousands of books in the same category that you're going to write about. But what makes you that person that's going to share something slightly different for that reader? So, if you're kind of going, well, I don't have anything, think about, what do people always ask you questions about? What do you believe that's just a little bit different than everybody else in your industry? Kind of where are you a little contrarian, or where is kind of that accepted, everybody believes this, but you don't necessarily think that that's the same. You don't have it the same lens on that item. And it doesn't have to be major, but you just need something a little bit different to hook people in and make it interesting so that it doesn't read like something else that, that they've read, because somebody's probably read other books about this subject that you're writing about, inevitably. That's one thing. And then the other thing is kind of what we've already discussed, which is kind of hook them back in to the book at many places, because it's not enough to get somebody to buy the book. You want them to read it. And so, a lot of people like me, I skim, I like read, and I'm like, I'll skim and I'll find something. I'm like, oh, that's interesting. So if you're constantly with your chapter titles, how you start the chapter, how you have subheadings, if you're constantly hooking them back in, they won't be able to put your book down. They will have to, even if they skim one section, they'll keep going and then they'll read the next section and the next section. And a lot of people kind of fail to apply this simple copywriting technique of, opening loops and then closing them, and opening some other ones and closing them, and writing that way. So those are some things that I think are really, really important to make a book, a much better read, even if it's nonfiction, sharing a ton of content.
Yeah, that really, it sounds so true to how I actually read a book these days. I think I used to, back in the day, read from cover to cover, but it was mostly nonfiction, or not mostly fiction, because you had to. But now that I read so many more like business books and self-help books and things like that, I do read them differently. If I read cover to cover, I would fall asleep and I wouldn't really get through it. But now with, I read everything digitally on my phone or on my computer screen. And I do jump around, because half the time I need help with like one topic that's in the book, and I jump straight to that. I see what's in it. And that sometimes sends me backwards then to want to know more about some setup to that. I do jump all over the place. That is so true to actually what's happening. I can't imagine I'm the only one that's reading like that these days.
No, I mean, that's how I read too. And I read a ton of books as well. So I think, and there are going to be people that read from cover to cover. But if you've written your book well, that you've already addressed that. So it's kind of like all those other people, you want to address them and keep them coming back and hooking them back in to finish your book.
Yeah. And I mean, the order of operations should make sense, because like, I would imagine if I'm trying to skim, I'm like, okay, well, I want to get past the beginning stuff. And then I know it's going to be somewhere in the middle or at the end, the thing I'm looking for, then that would just make sense. Let's talk a little bit about book titles for a second. Do they all need to have curse words in them these days? Is that like what's happening in books now? Like, what is going on with book titles?
I mean, preferably you don't. I know it seems trendy and a lot of people get excited about it, but it is such a pain in the butt. Like, you can't run ads. You can't we've had clients that insist on doing it, and it becomes a whole, jumping dance of who can we publish this with and who can we run ads with and how do you promote it. And some podcasters will not have you on their podcast if you have a swear word in your title, because they don't want anything to do with it. And some media will not, they'll never show your book on television if it's got a swear word on it. So everybody goes, yeah, but Mark Manson did so well. And I'm like, Mark Manson had a giant following when his book came out. You have 500 people, on your newsletter list. It's not the same. So yeah, it's better not to. I mean, if you're really, really focused on it, you really, passionate about it, you can do it, but you're limiting some of the things that you're going to allow yourself to be able to do.
Yeah. And that was a little tongue in cheek, but I'm going to throw just some random things at you. So How do you feel about and this is your perspective, right? Everyone's got their own thing that they'll do what they want. So like the using just very colloquial phrases as your book. So for me, it would be like, my book would be, dude, where's your brand? Or like, bro, tuck in your shirt, right? Like something like that. How do you feel about those?
That's great if you're addressing a certain type of guy in your audience, and if that's who your audience is, do it. Because the title has to speak to the reader. Like it doesn't matter if you like it, really. All that really matters is your reader going to go, that book's for me? And so if your title does that, it's easy for them to say, it's easy for them to remember, they can spell it, and there isn't another popular book out there that already has that same title, because everybody can have the same book titles unless it's trademarked. Like Freakonomics is a trademark title, so you can't do that. But most book titles are not copy. You can't trademark them. They can't be copyright protected. So yeah, you could do it. And if that speaks to your reader, I think it's great.
Yeah, I guess that is what I'm trying to get to the heart of, because I guess if it has to speak to your reader versus, because the other end of the spectrum would be very search engine optimization based. Like, I want to be the guy known for, personal branding. I think it's something we've had in common. You've written a book on that. Mm-hmm. So like, you have to use the word personal branding in the title. Like, yeah, that's the other end of the spectrum. How do you feel about that?
Yeah, you do. I mean, we usually leverage subtitles for the keywords. So, personal brand would be something I would probably put in the subtitle, kind of even calling out who your reader is, I would potentially put in the subtitle. So search engine optimization is important. And we do a lot of research, especially for Amazon and Google, for keywords, but we don't necessarily focus on that for the title, because the title does really need to be easy to say, easy to remember, something that speaks to your reader. So they're going to know at least what category or what kind of book it is when you say the title, something kind of weird, like, I'm trying to think of an example, but I love lamp.
Yeah.
Like what category does that book fall in? Who's that for?
Shout out to all the Anchorman fans out there.
Right? Exactly. Yeah. If it's not about Anchorman, I don't know what that book would be about. So.
Yeah. Well, let's get personal for a second. So, your book, Self-Publish and Succeed, it could have been called No Boring Books or something like that. And then, self-publish your way to success. Why did you pick something that was right there in the title?
It had alliteration. It's simple. It's easy to spell. It wasn't about search engine optimization. It was about kind of hitting that 3-word or less title that was easy to say, easy to remember, told you what it was about. And alliteration is great. Like, if you can get alliteration in your titles, that really makes it memorable for everyone. My second book, the personal brand book, the title was a disaster. It's called The New Brand You. And there's actually somebody else coming out with a book right now called The New Brand You. And I feel like writing them, telling them like, you're making a mistake. Because what I found was I did, I don't know, like 50 or so podcasts, like specifically to promote the book. And probably 45 of the podcasters, many who were actually holding a copy of the book in their hands, called it The Brand New You. And so if you've got a book title that just doesn't register in people's brain for whatever reason, it's a bad title. And when you search The Brand New You, sorry, now I'm getting them both mixed in my head. But when you search the wrong title, Dory Clark's branding books come up, not mine. So I probably sold some of her books in the process of my promotion. So the title has to be memorable and easy to say for people. And I now test all the titles. So I'm like, I tell somebody the title, and a little bit later I say, do you remember the book title? And if they stumble on it, and I do that again, and a few people stumble, that's not a good title.
See, there's so many things in alignment between your world and mine, because in the podcasting space that happened to me, in the website space that happened to me. The show used to be called, for those that are newer listeners, it used to be called Brandon Brands. And I take that back. The website was called Brandon Brands. And then, just to throw them a loop, I called the show Brands on Brands on Brands 3 times. Yeah. And I had both URLs owned and whatever else. And man, did that just cause enough confusion, because everyone thought that the website was Brands on Brands and that the show was called Brands on Brands. And they even thought my last name was Brands. It created a lot of confusion. Oh, yeah. And eventually I just changed it all to Brands on Brands, because I was like, well, that's what people were saying anyway.
Yeah.
And then now I get the comments. There's no confusion anymore, but I get the comments. You know what would have been great? You should have called it Brandon Brands. and I'm like, oh, I tried, man. I tried. It didn't work out for me. Let me ask you this. Do you have just a running list of like future book titles that it's like an unending list of things? Or have you now gotten so far into the matrix that like, you're like, I don't do that. I don't make that mistake anymore. Like, what's that like for you?
I have a little bit of a URL addiction. So whenever I think
same thing.
Something, I'm like, oh, that's a cool URL. And so I have a whole bunch. And when I'm working on a new book now on book marketing, and I've gone through my URLs and I'm like, are there any good URLs here that might make a good title? So yeah, I don't necessarily have a running book title list, but I do, as soon as I think of something, I think maybe someday that'll be a product or a book or a business or something, I go and I buy the URL. So I have way too many URLs.
I have that too, but now I've started a book list as well, like a future book list. And
That's
just
awesome.
every time a title hits me, whatever it is, I write it down. But is that helpful, or does that actually get in the way? Should I not even be thinking about book titles until I've actually figured out what I'm trying to write?
I mean, I have clients that have not been able to write their book until they get the title. Now, that said, the title probably changes by the time the book is written. So, I think the more dangerous thing is to fall in love with the title and to be really hung up on a title, because there's lots of things that can happen when you write the book. And at the end of the day, it's more important, I learned from my second book, it's more important to have a title that is going to speak to that reader and be memorable and easy to say, and really identify like who this book is for and why they're going to want to read it. And if your title doesn't do that after you've written the book, because as you write the book, you may find the concept evolves or it actually becomes a slightly different book than what you thought it would be. Being in love with the title can really hinder your ability to pivot or make adjustments as needed. But I think having titles that get you excited can be the thing. Like I've had authors who've written books because they were pumped about this title. It almost never ends up being the actual title of the book, but it got the book written. So
Yeah, I'll give one up for you. When I just started out and I was trying to build all these things, I wanted everything connected to the word brand and brand on, right? Because it was the simplest thing I could think of. And I was like, this is great. So I had a book. I was like, oh, I'm going to call it Brand On, Brand Off. And like, I can fit anything into that book.
yeah.
And, so I actually paid someone, because there's everyone's out there to take your money, right? And they were just like, oh, we'll sell you a book cover. Like, here's our book cover people. So I bought a book cover, never made the book. And that was I think a learning exercise for me, and maybe I'll make the book someday. Who knows? And maybe it'll be like book 4. So buyer beware out there for you guys on that one. I do want to switch gears because I just so many random questions that I know only I will ask that no one else is going to be thinking of. For my podcaster friends out there, you guys have anyone who goes to booklaunchers.com, there are some unique services that I haven't seen other people create, which are things like how to turn your podcast into a book, or how to turn your book into a course, and things like that, or vice versa. I forget which one it is. I love that you guys think like that, and you actually help and provide services that get there, as opposed to just we build books, right? Because I think that's really how people are thinking these days. How do I take the effort of one thing and use it to create lots of things, so I don't have to just start over and over and over again? I'm curious what success you've seen kind of in that space, with which one of those ideas you want to talk about.
Yeah, I mean, well, we're talking podcasting, so we can start there. So it's been interesting because we find that podcasters often write really great books, but they come to us thinking that they're going to take transcripts of their podcast episode, put them together, and it's going to become a book. Now, there are people who can turn books into that, but because we're very focused on creating a book that is not boring and that a reader's going to want, that's going to be marketable at the end, we often find that process is not going to work. So what we do first is we focus on, okay, who's exactly what we talked about. Who's the book for? What's your goal? And then what's that hook of the book? What's the outcome of the outcome for the reader, so that we've got that through line, the spine of the book. And then we look at the content and we go, okay, what pieces of that content make sense to fit here? We take the transcripts over and we kind of massage them in. There's always gaps. Like if you're doing this right, you probably have not covered all of the pieces in between, and you still have to write transitions and those kind of things anyways. But it's better than starting from nothing. But it is a different process than just saying, oh, here's my 12 episodes, turn them into a book, because we're crafting the book and then pulling from the content that way. That's very successful. We've had quite a few authors do well there, but it's not as simple as they think it's going to be when they come in.
That's really disappointing to hear. I just wanted to give you my transcripts and be done.
Courses do translate over. Our service that we have turns books into courses because books, are wonderful. A book is designed to be consumed and a course is designed to have people take action and kind of make that transformation. And so, but the content is still the backbone of it. But courses can translate really well into books because generally speaking, they're in a kind of format and they have a hook. They have an outcome for somebody if it's a course that's selling. So the difference, though, is that your course is probably fairly, I don't want to say boring, but it's, you're just kind of saying, hey, go do this. Here's what you need to do. And it's very information exchange. So the book needs the course content. It translates a lot more, but you need to add some more personality and stories to it to have it be a really strong book as well. But yeah, they all go hand in hand. And the content, like you said, you've done the hard work of thinking and creating this content. And it has so many uses and purposes and repurposing. And people say, oh, well, if they read my book, they want to buy my course. And that is just not true. I mean, you've got Oren Klaff's book there. With his first book, Pitch Anything, I love that book so much. I bought his course. He had a course that came out like 2 years after the book. I bought the course and the course was identical to the book, but I didn't care because I loved the book so much. I went through the course and then there was some support. There was some access to Oren. You had some calls with him. It was worth every penny. And I'd do it again. So yeah, it's for that. If you've got that clear outcome of an outcome, it can just go everywhere.
Yeah, Oren's been on the show. His book, Flip the Script, is his newer one, and Pitch Anything was his original one that like brought him to fame. If you guys haven't read either of those, they are, I think they are necessary reading for people who are, especially in the game of sales and persuasion. So, I love that guy. And then what's interesting too is I think there are all these, like if you're creating content in the education kind of space, you're a mentor, you're a coach. There's so many of these things that just work really well together, and being able to leverage them across platforms. I think it's like a snowball effect, right? Like you've already done one thing, like let's now turn it. Like I turned my podcast, I created a podcast, and then I realized I wanted to then divide it into seasons, and then the seasons, I'm organizing this as if I'm writing a book in my head. And I actually said, I'm going to turn this season into a course first. So I created a season based into a course, an online course. So I turned a season into a course. But then to your point, once I got it in there and I realized, okay, now what do I have to change to make this actually work as a course? Because it didn't just work by itself. It's not just like listening to podcasts. You have to actually take pieces into bite size, and instead of it half hour long, it's like 3 minutes. What's this step and what's this step? And then you had to add all these, like downloadable guides and things. And then after that, you had to say, okay, well, are there things missing from the step-by-step that I didn't add because it didn't make sense conversationally? So there was definitely a piece to that where you have to say, okay, what makes sense in the new format? But it was easier because all the knowledge was there. I didn't have to start from scratch. So I think there's some synergy there for sure.
Yeah, it works for talks too. So, if you've got, and that's also, something I recommend when people are thinking of chapter titles is I'm like, think about it as a talk. Like if you were going to get up and do a 40-minute talk, what would your talk title be? And what would you have to say in that talk to communicate it? And it goes the other way, right? You have chapters that probably will be a great talk topic. My book, the new brand you, now I'm going to keep calling it the brand new you because I've told the story now, it's in my head. But I had a chapter title called "You Are Who Google Says You Are." And that was pretty much the only thing that worked with that book. And I sold a lot of books giving talks on that subject to various groups and organizations because everybody's like, well, my people need to know that like they're being judged by their Google results. So, it was a great little feed in. And I just took the chapter content and turned it into a talk and a workshop.
You never know. I mean, it's like, well, in Oren Klaff's book, he has this one chapter called Plain Vanilla. And it stood out so much to me that I always use it in examples, and I use it in something I teach other people. And you never know what that nugget's going to be, but when you take those steps to actually break these things out into like bite-sized pieces, you might find some new revelation, to your point, that you could use in another way. That's amazing. Another random question as we're kind of coming towards the end here, because I just want to know, would you ever recommend an audiobook only without a book? Because for a podcaster, you're like, that seems like a temptation right there.
Yeah, I mean, so that's an interesting question because audio is growing rapidly. And, for the first time at the end of 2022, I kind of did my, kind of looking forward to 2023. And I said, not doing an audiobook is a mistake in 2023. And it's the first time I've kind of said that particular statement. That said, we're still seeing even the books that are selling incredibly well in audio, it's only 40% of their overall book sales. So yes, you could have an audio only, and there's certainly, Audible has been buying some people's or kind of paying people to do audio first or audio only books. So they're testing it too. But I feel like you're missing out if you skip it, because there still is that chunk of people who wants that physical book, and there's the people who, like me, I actually do audio and Kindle at the same time. So I switch because when I'm driving, I listen to the audiobook, but when I'm at home, it's usually before bed, I'm reading, trying to get 50 minutes of reading in, and I'm doing that on my Kindle. But I don't like to have 4 books going at the same time. I want to finish each book. So I switch between both. So you'd probably be missing out on somebody like me, because I wouldn't want to do an audio only unless I was really compelled to learn that subject.
Yeah, I guess you wouldn't have that asset to like physically distribute
Exactly.
and all those advantages as well. But
Mm-hmm.
if it gets you started, do what you got to do.
And I mean, that's the thing, like, there's no right answer to anything.
Sure.
And my answer to everybody is like, well, test it. Let me know how it goes.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. It's like, you could just call it like a gated podcast. Right now you can subscribe for like separate episodes, just experiment with that as its own book and see like what sells better. Maybe Amazon's going to do you a favor because they need more results in their search engine for Kindle books. I don't know. Check it out. Let me know. Like, comment on this episode. Let me know if it's something you'd be curious about trying.
Yeah.
This has all been super intriguing to me. I appreciate you sharing that with us today. One last question to kind of wrap us up here. Just in general, what are you most excited about overall? It could be in this business or just with you.
Well, with me, I'm excited to get my immigration sorted out, but that's a whole different story because I'm a Canadian living in Las Vegas right now. But going forward, I mean, I am actually really excited about audiobooks, like we just talked about. It's growth in an otherwise fairly, books don't change a lot year over year, like a little bit up, a little bit down, a little bit up. But audiobooks are growing. Spotify is in the audiobook space now, which I think is really exciting. So I'm pumped about that. AI coming in. I think there's some really cool opportunities to drive some of the costs down, to have some more creativity. I don't have the fear that AI is going to replace humans in this space anytime soon, but I do think there's going to be some cool opportunities, and there already are, in book covers and some things like that, for AI to contribute and reduce costs and make it easier. So those are some of the things I'm excited about, but typical entrepreneur, I have a long list of things I'm excited about.
Yeah. Well, awesome. Well, I appreciate again you sharing all of your knowledge and insight and perspective with us today. And if you guys want to hear more, that the website that we talked about today is booklaunchers.com. Pretty easy to find everything about Julie, her company, and how they help people. Her books are listed there, courses, ways to work with her. All the things are listed there. And go check it out and get that book out there. Get that idea out of your head. Give yourself another branding asset to add to your tool belt. Thanks for spending time with us today, Julie.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. And thank you guys for listening. As always, continue to tune in. We'll keep bringing you the tips, the tricks, and all these little deep dive questions that pull these little nuggets of insight out for you to implement in your business. And as always, we will catch you next time.
You've just taken your marketing knowledge to another level with this episode of Brands on Brands. But we have plenty more ways to help you build a brand that matters. Head over to brandsonbrands.com for resources, as well as access to our blogs, videos, and exclusive coaching sessions with your host. Be sure to visit brandsonbrands.com.